Hello, I'm Sophie. I'll be doing the motion debrief for round 5 of ABPDC. The motion is this House prefers occupation to sector unionism. And it comes with an info slide that reads as follows: for the purposes of this debate, occupation unionism refers to labour unions that represent specific jobs, e.g. teachers union, writers union. Sector unionism refers to labour unions that represent industrial sectors, e.g. construction workers, media workers. So broadly speaking, I think this debate is probably about whether we want smaller, more focused unions or larger and less focused ones. Obviously, the magnitude of difference in terms of size or focus is going to be contested by different teams, but I think in general terms, this is where the debate's likely to end up. I'm not going to neatly divide closing from opening material because obviously which half of the debate takes what arguments and in what degree of detail is kind of definitionally debate specific. But I will make some comments along the way about material that I think might be reasonable grounds for an extension. So firstly, starting with the government bench, the first thing that I think I do at opening government is just explain a bunch of other ways that occupation-based unions can support each other, even where they're not part of the same union or the same organizational structure. So unions can donate or encourage their members to donate to the community funds of other unions. That is the funds that, for instance, allow people who are on strike to continue to support themselves. Unions can issue public statements in support of other unions that are striking. You can have kind of aligned concurrent strikes. So the Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild are currently striking at the same time. And those are separate strikes organized separately for the interests of the members of those two unions. But because they're happening at the same time, they kind of create the effect of a mass movement, or they seem like they're part of a mass movement. And finally, you can in some cases engage in solidarity action, which is where different industries strike in support of one another. And solidarity action is illegal in most of the world, but I guess it's not illegal everywhere, and sometimes it's useful enough to be worth it. The other thing, of course, we'd want to explain in this argument is why unions have not only the capacity, but also the incentive for this kind of inter-union fidelity, even where they're not part of the same organization. And I think we just say that unions benefit from keeping one another strong. Often there are relationships between different union leaders, and presumably the opposition bench wants this to be at least a little bit true in order for the different factions within sector unions to cooperate nicely. And so the strategic benefit then of this argument is that it allows us to capture some of the benefit that we gain from size and numbers of a sector-based union without the costs of total integration. The second thing then we'd explain is why occupation-based unions just make better and more appropriate demands than sector-based unions do. And I think the claim here is just that demands vary and clash a lot within the industries. Between people who have different jobs. So for instance, writers like TV writers and journalists are very scared of AI. AI represents a really important existential threat to their work, but it doesn't represent the same kind of existential threat to the work of actors, for instance. But if you shoved all those people together into a media-based sector union, then the priority given to AI or to kind of tackling AI's infringement on people's jobs is going to change depending on what party, has more power within that union, and not everyone's interests are going to be served. Priorities also vary according to class and economic position. Even just something like how dangerous or costly a strike is for a person to undertake changes a lot depending on the kind of job they work or how much money they have and so on. The next thing, of course, we want to explain on government is just that industrial action becomes much more effective. So the first thing I think I'd say here is just that unions function better internally now because you have fewer people and because those people are more aligned because they're all in the same industry. And that means it's much easier to come to consensus on issues and decide what to do. There's probably less room for corruption if unions are smaller. And I'll just note that this part of the argument, I think, about how unions function internally probably benefits from quite granular and detailed analysis, like more granular analysis than I'm giving right now. And so perhaps a closing team is kind of well placed to extend here. The next thing then I think I'd try and show in this argument is just that you have more dedicated members of unions because they're only fighting for their own interests rather than the interests of a broader sector. And they're probably engaging in fewer strikes. They're not striking for stuff that doesn't directly concern them. And I think we want to do a bit of weighing here to say that having more people in a union isn't automatically a benefit if those people are just dead weights who are doing actively bad things like breaking strikes. What matters is having a dedicated core of people, and you're much more likely to have that when you're dealing with occupation-based unions rather than sector-based unions. The final part of this argument, I think, is explaining why the response to industrial action is much better. So in the case where we are trying to influence public opinion, where the employer of people in a union is the government, the concerns of those unions are likely to be much more legible and sympathetic to the public if you have kind of a clear narrative about what people in this one industry want, rather than, you know, a range of different concerns of people who are doing different jobs in the same sector. And this industrial action, in the case of the private sector, can provide a more sort of direct and targeted attack on employers. The final thing I might note on government is that I think because occupational unions have a narrower focus, it's probably a bit easier to start an occupational union in the first place in regions or industries where labor movements are super nascent or where almost no unions exist at all. Cool. So that is the government bench. Then in terms of the opposition bench, thinking about why sector unionism is really awesome, I think the first and main claim we'd make is just that sector unions are much bigger and they're much more well-resourced than occupation-based unions. They have more people, they have more money, they have more media attention, and so on. And the context that makes this super important is that unions in most industries, in most parts of the world, are very weak and small. Union membership is at the lowest it's been since we started, you know, keeping records on this stuff. And that's for a range of reasons, many of which I'm sure you're aware of. The fact that there's been a decline in professions that have traditionally comprised unions, so professions like manufacturing, for instance. There's been an increase in casualization of work in many countries, which means that it's both more costly and less worth it to join a union because your eggs are spread over more baskets. There have been certain changes to government policy in some countries that make it harder to form unions now than it used to be. And I guess unions in some places have kind of won on some issues, which means that joining them feels less urgent. And none of these are reasons that can be just ameliorated by the issue specificity of occupational unions. But now what you have with sector unions is you have way, way more people. So strikes can go for a lot longer and they can be more effective. You can pose a greater threat to employers or a greater inconvenience to the public. And members of those unions probably want to continue and are motivated to engage in that industrial action because they have a greater faith that it will succeed. In addition, I think governments and companies probably feel a little bit less empowered to crack down on unions when they're larger, or there's at least more outrage when they do. And that's, of course, a very good thing. Another note I might make here is that I think we could say counterfactually, unions have strong incentives in some cases to undermine one another. So for instance, doctors want pay taken away from nurses, or are going to say we work much longer hours than them because people feel as though another industry that they're competing with, if they get a pay rise, we're going to take a pay cut. People feel like industrial action is sort of zero-sum game. So it's good when you put these people together. And obviously this argument is a little bit risky because it kind of concedes some of the stuff we were saying over on the government side of the debate. Like, it indicates that consensus building within unions is kind of difficult if you're dealing with all these factions who have different interests. But I think that's a reasonable bullet to bite if we can explain why integration into one union is going to go a long way to ameliorate those divisions. But maybe it's a more, attractive bullet to bite if we're at closing and we have a bit more time to make the argument carefully. The final thing we probably want to say then on opposition is just that the demands these unions are making, or the, different people within them, are sufficiently similar. And that's to say, like, firstly, these people broadly have pretty similar interests. Yes, maybe writers care a little bit more about AI than actors do, but all of these people care about not getting, owned by Disney or by Murdoch or whomever. Construction workers all broadly care about safe working conditions and fair pay, etc. A lot of the time, people are going to have the same employers. So people are all, for instance, going to be employed by the government, which means that demands you make are going to be relatively similar. And a kind of aggressive claim that we could make here is that sometimes certain industries are going to actually just have bad demands. And these are demands that get moderated when they are engaged in a sector-based union where there are more people to outvote them, or more people to debate them, or other concerns to deal with. So for instance, the Australian Medical Association has lobbied really aggressively for a reduction in places for specialty medical training, so that there are fewer specialists, in order to keep wages high for the people who are specialists. And obviously a side effect of having fewer specialists is that you have much longer waiting lists, particularly in the public sector, and allied health, like nurses and emergency service workers and so on, feel the brunt of those long waiting lists and of a dearth of specialists. And so it might be the case that in a kind of broad health sector-based union, the more, selfish or evil demands that the AMA makes kind of get moderated a little bit by other people. And of course, again, we risk that argument getting flipped, like the government might say, well, nurses actually are going to get overwhelmed by the AMA. But again, if we make this claim well, I think it can be useful, and potentially, again, it's some good material for us to extend on at closing. So those are some thoughts about this motion. Hopefully at least some of that was helpful, and I hope ABPDC is very fun and everyone does well tomorrow.